All right, folks, we've still got a few people popping in here, but I think in the interest in time for our speakers today, we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here with us this afternoon, this evening. Can everyone hear me? Is my mic working well? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. We're here I'm very excited for our first community conversation for the ASU LGBTQ Faculty Staff Association. And today we're going to be talking about after the election. So what's next for us as a community, both locally and nationwide, with the recent elections, the after effects of those elections, and recent changes in the Supreme Court. So thank you all for being here with us. My name is Zachary Reeves Blurton. I'm the president of the ASU Faculty or LGBTQ Faculty Staff Association for 2020-2021. And Community Conversations is a new initiative that we're just launching as we try to get back out there in the community. We kind of got sidelined by COVID and a lot of other things over the last 9 or 10 months or so. So this is us getting our foot back in the door and trying to be a part of our larger ASU community. So we're really glad that you're here to be a part of this. Please, if you do have any feedback about today's program or any ideas for anything else that we're doing, please feel free to drop us a line, and we do have contact information coming up quickly. Just very briefly, the charter of our Faculty Staff Association has 3 main pillars. We're here to promote, to identify, and to serve in various capacities for our campus community. We promote and exchange ideas about the policies and issues that affect our LGBTQ community at ASU and also in our broader communities. And we're also here to promote a better understanding and appreciation on the part of the university and the community as a whole of the issues that our community faces. We're here to identify effective ways and means of expressing our community's concerns to the proper university officials and to suggest practical remedies as appropriate. And finally, we're here to serve by partnering with student organizations and others who share our organization's concerns and philosophy and interest in the betterment of our university community, and by communicating to university administration the issues and concerns of our community here at Arizona State University. I'm going to turn over the floor here in just a moment, but I'd like to introduce briefly our facilitator and our panelists today. And thank you all very much for taking the time this evening to join us. This session will be facilitated by Ann Kotleba. She's the campus director of Nonprofit Leadership Alliance here at Arizona State University and a lecturer in the School of Community Resources and Development, and is also our past president and current secretary of the LGBTQ Faculty Staff Association. We're also joined by Joshua Thompson and Matthew Dempsey, both faculty associates, with the School of Politics and Global Studies. Joshua is additionally an academic success coordinator for the Interplanetary Initiative, and Matthew Dempsey is a recent PhD graduate here at Arizona State University. So with that, I will turn over the floor to Ann.
All right, great. Thanks, Zach, and welcome everybody. It's exciting to be here on this Tuesday evening in what would have been finals week, but now it's just, grading week and whatever, get stuff done before the holiday break time. So thanks for all, to everybody for taking the time to be with us. I know we are all Zoom experts now, but just a few housekeeping things before we get started. I recommend you can put it in your Zoom into presenter view if you want to. We're not going to be sharing screen or having any PowerPoints or any of that. So you can either be in our favorite Brady Bunch display or in the presenter view if you prefer. As you heard when you joined on. This is going to be recorded, so we'll be sharing that link out with everyone that registered after it gets published, and so we'll be able to share that with anyone who is unable to make it today. And yeah, hopefully our bandwidth will withhold everybody that is here today, but feel free to keep your cameras on or off or whatever. If you're my students, you can just kind of like zone out for a while and then pop back in when you have a question all of a sudden. And in terms of questions, we're going to be taking those through, I guess the outline of today is how we're going to address this is we're going to have Josh and Matthew kind of lead us in their discussion with themselves first, and kind of a short little hear from them. But then we encourage everybody. We encourage this to be more of a dialogue and communication amongst everybody. So we're going to be using the chat. Zach and I will be monitoring that. I'll be facilitating, and we'll be popping in with questions. But if you feel like you want to clarify your question or or want to expand on it based on that, we'll give you the opportunity to open up your mic as well too. Yeah, that's on my list. So with that, we're going to let our presenters introduce themselves, and we'll start with, I don't know, who wants to start? Josh, you're to my left, so why don't you lead us off?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Anne and Zach and the rest of the LGBT Faculty and Staff Association for inviting us to have this important conversation today. This is definitely something that's probably been on all of our minds for the last 4 years, but especially this year as a lot of quick changes have happened politically. So a little bit about myself. As Zach mentioned, I'm the academic coordinator for the Interplanetary Initiative and a faculty associate for the School of Politics and Global Studies, where I teach a variety of classes, including law and society, research methods, statistics. Honestly, if you name it, I've probably taught it. And in addition to that, I'm cat mom, and dog mom as well. I am queer, gay, genderqueer. I use all pronouns, so feel free to address me however you're comfortable. And I think really importantly, I finished my dissertation about 2 years ago, and my dissertation was on court legitimacy, which is the public opinion of the court. To kind of tie in why that's so important to this conversation, just briefly, the courts do not have the conventional mechanisms of state violence or state control that Congress or the legislature and the executive, like the president, have. And so the courts are extremely reliant upon, or we believe, upon public support in order to hold legal institutions accountable to court decisions. And so a lot of things can affect the Supreme Court or the public's opinions about the Supreme Court's legitimacy. I think that's probably going to be a pretty core piece of this conversation today. So that's a little bit about me. What about you, Matthew?
We're supposedly Zoom experts. You would think I would know to unmute myself by now. I always think the start video should unmute you automatically, but anyway, it doesn't do that. So, I'm Matthew Dempsey. Some of my students are here, so yay, you get to sit through me droning on again. So thank you to my students for joining. But let's see. Prior to earning my PhD, I actually worked in politics for about 8 years for various members of the US House of Representatives, so members of Congress. And then I got tired of that and I said, I don't want to do this anymore, so I'll do my PhD. So then I came to ASU for my PhD, and I've been teaching here as a grad student and or, real PhD for 7 years now. My research interests are primarily campaigns and elections or media and politics, but I've taught a lot of courses on the Congress, surprise, surprise, given my background, but also the American legal system. So I'm super excited to have this chat, and I can't wait to hear all the questions. And hopefully between Josh and I, our brain power combined, we can answer them in a sufficient way.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us and for sharing some of your backgrounds. And so to start us off, I think we're going to kind of address a few of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then kind of give you guys an opportunity to kind of just play off of that for a little bit, and then we'll kind of open it up to more immediate Q&A from our audience members today. So I guess we should start with, should we be concerned? What is happening? Does everyone want to kind of explain kind of why this is an important topic right now?
Josh, you want to go first?
Yeah, we can maybe start with just a little bit of an overview for people who are maybe less familiar. I know that politics is something that you're either usually pretty passionate about or gets put on the back burner. So I'm sure all of you are aware that we currently have a new president-elect. The Democratic nominee for president, Joe Biden, appears to have achieved all that he needed to, received all the votes he needed to in order to become the next president next January. While that is happening, in the last year, the Supreme Court's balance has shifted. So we lost one of our most liberal justices, Justice Ginsburg. For those of you who are political science nerds, it might be interesting to know that she is actually much more centrist than most of the more conservative justices, just FYI. So the court was already very conservatively slanted, but after losing her and seeing her appointment, who is being flagged for a huge number of anti-LGBT, anti-women's rights, anti-privacy concerns from her previous career as an academic and as a judge, she's now replaced Justice Ginsburg on the court, which gives the conservatives on the court a 6-3 majority, which is a pretty challenging majority. And so right now, a lot of people in our community are asking what's going to happen to our rights. We are coming out of, 4 years ago, having the Obama administration who really worked to find ways of promoting the LGBT community and finding ways to keep us safe and keep our rights intact. And we've seen that really shift over the course of the last 4 years under President Trump. And now we're worried. Are we going to lose marriage rights? Are we going to have equal employment rights? Are transgender individuals going to face additional hurdles? What is going to happen to our community? So Matthew, did you want to add anything to, I waited until you took a drink.
Sure. Just like waiters at a restaurant, exactly. Impeccable timing. The only thing I think I'll mention as a sort of an overview, which is often the thing that's most surprising to my students, and Josh, you were alluding to this earlier, is we do not have to listen to the Supreme Court. There is no enforcement mechanism. They can decree something and we can ignore it. There is no mechanism for listening to anything the Supreme Court has said. It's entirely based on historical American norms. And without getting too academic, in fact, the Supreme Court gave itself the power to review the constitutionality of laws. That's not in the Constitution. So the Supreme Court, in a way, is unconstitutional. It's very interesting. But for most of American history, we have listened to what they say. There are a few examples where actually presidents and or the Congress or states completely ignored the Supreme Court. But for the most part, if they rule something, we have assumed that that is the final say because the court gave themselves the power to give the final say. But so, for example, if they overturned marriage today, we don't have to listen to them, meaning the states or the president or the Congress. So that's sort of, my gut reaction to the question of should we be worried? No. But I don't know if that's a realistic one. That's just sort of my gut reaction, and we'll explore this more. But I think those two sort of facts are interesting to keep in mind in any discussion of the court.
Absolutely. So kind of moving from there, I think that there are 4 main areas that I would identify as being areas of concern for our community. In those areas, the top of the list is marriage equality. What is going to happen to our right to marry the person of our choosing? Another is adoption and other family rights. Those are currently being challenged. The Supreme Court is currently debating the ruling on whether organizations that the state uses or that the city uses can discriminate against the LGBT community based on their religious perspectives. So we could see some real challenges in the area of family law. Job security is another one. This summer, we had a very promising ruling on LGBT rights for job security. Many of you probably saw that the court sorry, I'm checking my notes, Bostek versus Clay County, Georgia, ruled that that basically you could not discriminate against an individual based on their sexuality or gender due to the Fair Employment Act. So we do have some safety there, and I think we'll probably come back to that case and those questions a little bit later as well. So job security is a third, and then finally privacy. Some of you who have been around a little longer or who are maybe a little bit more familiar with our roots in the queer community will remember that it has very often in American history, in fact, for a majority of American history, been strictly illegal to engage in gay sexual behavior. And that is for gay men or lesbians or anybody else. And those laws, those anti-gay sex laws were struck down by the case of Lawrence v. Texas, which gave us the right to, in our bedroom, engage with each other the way that we want to. And there is some reason to wonder whether those rights, all four of those rights, could be refined, it could be changed, and could be chipped away over the course of the next several years until the court is rebalanced.
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything Josh said. I'm not that concerned. And maybe that is naivete, I don't know. But I think there are some bright spots. So one, more LGBTQ plus candidates ran for office than ever before. In 2020, there was a 41% increase over even 2018, which was a record year. And, if estimates are correct, only 0.17% of elected officials are a part of this particular community. And so as LGBTQ folks begin to run for office, they can be, in a way, the human story. There's countless stories in the Congress or state legislatures where things have been stopped because a member of that body stood up and said, hey, this affects me on a personal level. And other people are like, oh, I can put a name to a face kind of deal, right? And so I think it's super encouraging that members of the community are running for office and winning and succeeding. And I think that's exciting. But there was the question in the chat was sort of about, well, can we count on the Congress to, be the what's the word I want? The dam that stops the flood, so to speak. The House, yes, at least for the next 2 years. The Senate, no. However, there are some bright spots. So for example, just this past election, 2020, Nevada, back in 2002, they passed a state constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage in 2000 and then 2002, because you have to pass it twice there for it to become law. And they just repealed it. And interestingly, the margins flipped. It was basically 60-30 in 2002 for the ban, and it flipped this year. It's basically 60-30 to get rid of it. So that's encouraging. So it can be up to the states. And so state legislatures are preparing for a conservative state court. An analogous situation is Louisiana, who just passed an amendment to say abortion is not guaranteed by the state constitution. So their conservatives are getting ready to have abortion outlawed in their state, whereas Nevada, which is a bit more progressive, is preparing, like, hey, in case the Supreme Court does this, we're cool with gay marriage. So assuming the court does it, which it's hard to say, it'll be up to the individual states, maybe counties or cities, to determine. But at this time, assuming I Googled correctly, there are 30 states that have amendments to their state constitution outlawing marriage between two men or two women. And Nevada is the first of the two to reverse that. And so we'll see what happens with the other 30. So it'll be interesting to watch over the next couple of years, assuming something happens at the state court level, or I'm sorry, the Supreme Court level.
Yeah, and I like how you phrase that in looking at the silver linings. I definitely think that there are a lot of silver linings, a lot of protective institutions or actors that can help us to stay safer, to keep our families together, and to reject any attempts at removing our rights. So I would say one of them, and Matthew, you've hit on this a couple of times, and I'm sure that all of you are kind of thinking about this, it's precedent. And if any of you watched the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings, you may have heard her talking about things like super precedent and some things along those lines. But the reality is that it would be a logistical nightmare for the court to strike down marriage equality in the United States. It would cause a tremendous amount of trouble for all of our federal agencies, which have been undergoing processes to accommodate for queer families. And really, it's despite the fact that John Roberts authored the dissent in Obergefell, which is the gay marriage case. It is really unlikely that he'll be willing to allow that precedent to go away. And I think that is supported by the fact that he did vote in favor of bostek, or vote with the majority in bostek v. Clay County, which extended or confirmed equal rights to employment for the LGBT community. So precedent is something that judges don't want to walk away from. And one kind of example of that we've even seen is, many people after Roe v. Wade was passed became, militantly anti-abortion. The court was able to readdress Roe v. Wade with Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the early 90s. And they said, basically, we can't go back on abortion itself. We can go back on some of the things surrounding it. We can redefine this. And so if the court is going to come after queer families and queer rights, they're probably going to do it relatively piecemeal. One of those cases could be the one that we're looking at right now, coming out of Pennsylvania, with the Catholic Adoption Agency that feels that it's being discriminated against by not being allowed to discriminate against queer couples. But this is something that we've been hearing a lot about in politics. We've been hearing a lot about basically religious evangelicals in particular who are mostly just afraid of what this change could look like. And so they're trying to legislate around that change to assure that, that they'll have the ability to treat people the way that they want and to enforce their beliefs in things like the business place or in family court. So that is all to say, precedent is something that is probably going to keep us relatively safe. And then another would be that legitimacy, that idea of legitimacy. And again, I think that John Roberts is very aware of the impact that an anti-gay marriage ruling would have on the legitimacy of the court. It's going to look nakedly partisan. There's no way around that. And a majority of the country right now supports gay marriage and has for a while. And so the flexibility that the court has to go back on that, it doesn't seem like that would be something that they'd be willing to do because of the public confidence that they'll lose over time.
Yeah, I think my final thought before I'm ready for questions, Josh, not to rush you, is one, Josh has known me for years, and it's funny that you comment, I'm looking for the silver lining. I never do that. I think I'm realist. My family would say pessimist. So the fact that I'm the one being like, we're good, it says something. But I think the final piece for me that is enheartening, is that a word, is encouraging, is that Biden was elected president. And I don't say that as a partisan argument, like as a Democrat or something like that, but it was Biden, who we might recall, that pushed the Obama administration to come out for gay marriage before Obama was ready to do so. It was 2012, running for re-election. Obama was trying to play the middle against Romney, and Biden was like, hey, no, we're for gay marriage. And Obama had to be like, oh, crap. Okay, yeah, we're for gay marriage, right, as an administration. So Biden has often been, at least in the past decade or so, on the forefront here. He has pledged that in his first 100 days that he wants to pass the Equality Act, which essentially amends the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include sexual orientation and gender. The House has already passed it. They passed it 2019. The Senate is the stumbling block. I don't think Democrats will do well in Georgia, so it will continue to be a stumbling block, I think. So he can't pass things on his own, but at the very least, he's out there saying, this is something I want to see done. It's a legislative priority in my first 100 days in office. The second thing that he does have power over is he's also promised to defend American diplomats who criticize the countries that they are sent to as ambassador that have anti-LGBTQ agendas in their home countries. The Trump administration did not do that. And so Biden said, no, I'm going to stand by these ambassadors, which might seem like a little thing to us here in the States because it doesn't affect us directly. But from a global level, Biden seems to at least be sensitive to these issues and realize that in a lot of other countries, right, being gay for all intents and purposes is still illegal in many ways. And so supporting those ambassadors, I think, is a good symbolic step for the world.
And yeah, I agree, Matthew, that not that I'm willing to take questions now as well. So not to, that was like a really abrupt. I'm sorry. I was trying to read in the chat and kind of lost myself. But yeah, Anne, if you'd like to share some questions with us.
Well, I'd just like to kind of add on to, because I think it might be interesting to some of our audience members, is just to play off what you were just talking about, is that we have, because we're coming out of this, yes, it looks like Joe Biden will be our next president, fighting any drastic decision in the next few weeks or so. But is there, so how do we reconcile the fact that overwhelmingly, numbers that we have never seen before voted against him, and how does public opinion then transfer into the future of the courts? Because we kind of saw that in with Obama changing his opinion, changing his views on marriage equality and certain things around that. You had a lot of that being driven by our public opinion. And so how do you think that will kind of play into these, you kind of started mentioning with the legitimacy of the court, and I'd just like to maybe expand on that a little bit.
I would say, for one of the headlines that I've seen recently is that the Supreme Court is sticking heavily to public supported positions in their rulings this year. And absolutely, public opinion matters. And like we said, the public's opinion is really what holds government institutions accountable for court decisions, like Matthew was saying as well. And so, it is important. One of the early questions that we kind of had to start digesting what we would discuss today was, what can we do? And I think that we are in a really good position to retain a lot of our rights. I do think that we are very likely to see some of those rights change over the course of the next several years, while the Supreme Court probably allows for religious exemptions to our rights. That said, we can hold the courts accountable to some extent in a variety of different ways. One, Matthew kind of hit on this, but we can go to our own state and we can say, please pass marriage equality. Arizona's marriage equality is based on the federal courts, based on readings of federal law. And so we do not have state level gay marriage or queer marriage in Arizona. So that is one step that we could take. And that would kind of eliminate a lot of the problems that we're seeing in terms of policy. Another is, as much as it's uncomfortable to talk about, court reform is probably something that's really urgently necessary in the United States. During the entire Obama administration, what we saw was Republicans in Senate slow walking and blocking judicial appointments, not just at the Supreme Court, but at all levels of the federal court. And what that did was create this backlog of open seats that President Trump has been able to fill through additional appointments. And that has changed the entire nature of the courts. And federal courts are so important all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the federal courts are making a majority of those decisions. A majority of those decisions don't go to the Supreme Court. And we don't tend to think a lot about that. So court reform could be really, really important. Court reform makes a lot of us uncomfortable. One of my colleagues is in this call, and I was talking with her son about it a little bit this fall, because he was like, it feels like cheating. If we change the number of justices on the court, it just feels like we're cheating. But I would encourage all of you to think about the fact that Mitch McConnell changed the number of members of the court in 2016. And he changed that number from 9 to 8, and he left it that way for about a year. And then they decided to change it again from 8 to 9. Changing the number of people on the court, not really new. It's already a political game. Some other things we can think about is we can think about readjusting the court's jurisdiction, which is another thing that Matthew kind of talked about. The Supreme Court's jurisdiction is defined by Congress through statute. We don't have to have a constitutional amendment to redefine that. And so maybe it's time for us to start talking to our representatives about how we would redefine the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to assure the Congress literally has an ability to create a gay marriage court if they wanted, and to staff that with the justices that they wanted. And so we are not stuck with the Supreme Court. We can change that number. We could add term limits. These are all conversations that we really need to be having including maybe the entire approval process, generally speaking. The fact that that process has become so partisan and so broken that we basically went 8 years without any federal appointments in the last 4 years, the Trump administration has been able to outpace all 8 years of Obama's appointments. And that has a lot of, this spells a lot of trouble for us down the line. So getting engaged politically, starting to write your members of Congress, and I would say, come to the LGBT Faculty and Staff Association meetings, build this community, help each other, support each other, listen to what's going on, because there's a really good chance that we will need to pivot quickly and start organizing in order to protect ourselves. Maybe that's going to be with ASU policy, maybe that's going to be with Arizona policy, maybe that's going to be on more of a federal level, but we do need to be ready to protect our rights. It is very helpful that we have the Biden administration to make decisions that will benefit our community. But the Supreme Court is definitely in a position right now where they are likely to chip away at our rights. Sorry, that was long-winded, Matthew.
Okay.
Yes, and I was wondering, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've got nothing to add. We can go to the next question.
Great, yeah, because I was wondering if you could then kind of expand on this towards the need for advocacy in terms of not just, right, we've talked a lot about kind of like what currently exists, but what about the future? Where do we see kind of trans rights, especially kind of heading in the future, and what can that look like within, how can we help support that?
I admittedly am not an expert on this particular issue, but what I would wager is that gay marriage is relatively safe. Where there will be things that are not protected, I believe it will be for the trans community. That's something that I think is a step too far for the current Congress or state legislatures. So while they might not move to actively discriminate via legislation, they're not going to probably actively move to protect trans rights or those kinds of issues. In the age of, Uber Eats and Grindr or Tinder or fill in the blank instant gratification sort of apps, it's kind of hard, I think, to remember that, the gay marriage decision by the Supreme Court was not that many years ago. And Lawrence v. Texas, I think I was in undergrad when that came down. So early 2000s, gay rights have moved much more quickly than we could say civil rights for racial minorities or even women. So a lot has happened really quickly. And so I think that's one reason we see a lot of resistance from the conservatives. It's like whiplash for them. It's 15, 20 years ago, there was nothing. And now all of a sudden we're talking about bathrooms or trans rights or things that they weren't prepared to discuss, defend, or what have you. But there was a question in the chat. It also came in early about, if we get married in Arizona and I move to Nevada, is my marriage legal? I'm kind of going off on a complete tangent now. If the Supreme Court does indeed overturn gay marriage, then yes, it would be state by state. And so if your marriage is recognized by Arizona, then great. If not by Nevada, then it's not, or Nevada it would be. But you get what I'm saying. It becomes a state by state issue. I was thinking earlier today, what it could also become is an employer by employer issue. Will my boss give my partner insurance, or will they not? So in some cases, it's going to be completely up to just the person you work for. Right. And so as Josh was saying, there's so many things to untangle. Where I will be a slight pessimist is, Roberts, as a staunch conservative, has often sided with the more moderate to liberal wing of the court to uphold Obamacare, for example. But now he's not the one to flip. Even if he flips, it's still 5-4 on the conservative side. So that's the one place where I'm perhaps a little bit cautious about my optimism, is that even if, he sides with the liberals, the newest justice is not very likely. In fact, she was one who agreed with the dissenters on a 2015 case, specifically about trans. It was whether or not trans individuals, whether or not Title IX, which typically covers gender issues, female, like sports and things like that, making sure it's equal. There were dissenters in the case saying, no, it does not cover trans individuals. And she Amy Coney Barrett said, I support the dissenters. So it's things like that that I think, I don't know that gay marriage will go away, but some of these newer issues to the national scene, I think, are much more at risk.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that where we're also going to see some of the pushback from this court is going to be on commercial spaces. I'm sure all of you will recall or have heard of the wedding cake controversy coming out of Colorado. Can a baker be forced to make a cake for a gay wedding? You know, I think most of you, like me, feel that you should be able to walk into any public institution and order the products or goods that they're serving. It would be very complicated for us if we had to make sure we found, you know, oh, I can't go to the Christian one, I've got to go to the atheist bakery. And so, you know, I think we're going to see some changes in that area. I definitely think that the job security issue is safer than not, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on. Also, being in higher ed, though, we are in a kind of an advantageous position with the question of LGBT employment rights. From the previous ruling, you know, we're in good shape, but then also the places where they're going to be allowing discrimination are not going to be state schools. They're going to be looking at religious organizations, religious institutions, religious, you know, companies. And so, you know, there's, I think, a very low likelihood that there's going to be any footing for somebody to claim that recognizing gay marriage through the state is somehow impeding on somebody's rights. Again, I think adoption and family law are going to be challenges. I think that we're already, speaking of people kind of shuffling around a little bit, I've heard that there's been some shuffling in several Midwestern states to begin legislating basically straight family law in order to lock out queer parents. There's a case right now about birth certificates. I cannot remember the state, but the question is, you know, is the state compelled to add two people of the same gender if they are the parents of a child? The state says no. And so those are the kind of things that we're going to have to be careful about. And I think this really ties into, you know, what Dan Childer says in the chat. There are so many different pieces to these puzzles. And so, you know, and marriage is more than even just marriage itself. Marriage is about family. And so can your family get the support that it needs to grow in the way that you think is appropriate? And I think that that's the kind of thing that we might see challenges on. We might see that the state of Arizona is working with an adoption agency that refuses to work with queer couples, and that the court may support that. So I do think, you know, there are some places, and definitely trans rights. We're going to see a lot of the policy changes from the Trump administration overturned, honestly, probably day one or within the first week of the Biden administration. Thank goodness. Looking at the ability of trans individuals to join the military, looking at the way that some of the things that Matthew was talking about with the way that the federal government interacts with queer couples and queer ideologies. So, you know, there are a lot of fronts that we've got to keep our eyes on and keep our ears open, which is another, I'm going to keep plugging it, and I know we're going to get to this later, but you know, think about joining organizations like this so that we can share that information, so that we can reduce the cost of collective action, and that we can be responsive as the need arises. We are very, very lucky in this association because we do have people. We have institutional memory from the people who brought us the right to get domestic partner benefits. And so they know how to have this fight, and they know how to work within the ASU system. So we're in a good place to protect our rights in this institution.
Right, and we're very grateful for those who have kind of led the way. You know, as myself, as somebody who is relatively recent, moving to Arizona is one of my largest concerns. Right, I was married in Maryland. Is my marriage going to be legal? I moved to Arizona. Do I want to move to Arizona because of that? Right, that's not, you know, that's a very real conversation that a lot of us have to have, and a lot of us are thinking about in the future. So. With that, can you, we started unpacking this a little bit, but could you all go into a little bit of what the Equality Act might bring and how that might help? I know there's a question in the chat about that, and how that might kind of reinforce some of these ideas about employers. And then to that too, the bostek ruling earlier this year of how that helped support from the court's perspective.
Yeah, Matthew, do you want to hit on the Equality Act and then I can hit on bostek?
You know, it's one of those things I've not paid too much attention to it, to be completely honest. But I do know that it would be an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of '64. And basically, it's going to prohibit all of the things that the Civil Rights Act of '64 prohibits for sexual orientation and gender identity. So whether that's public accommodations, facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, the list goes on and on and on. But it would simply codify in federal law that this kind of discrimination is not legal. So it's very much like the ERA amendment from the early '70s that was essentially trying to grant all those things to women. It's trying to grant it to the sexual orientation or gender identity.
And then for Bostek versus Clay County, Georgia, that is a decision that came earlier this year that affirmed that queer rights, in particular gender identity and sexual orientation, are protected under under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So again, what we're basically saying with that is, it's a protected class. If you're discriminating against a lesbian, you're discriminating against that lesbian based on her gender because of the expression that expression of her love. And so because the court says we can't disconnect those, it said that it is illegal to discriminate based on sexual identity and gender identity. What's really important, I think, about that ruling, and Matthew kind of hit on this a little bit, but this was actually a 6-3 ruling, and me on the liberal sides of the court, but no, the liberal side of the court was joined by Gorsuch and by John Roberts. Again, I think that we have reason to believe that John Roberts is going to continue to rule in an increasingly moderate way in order to preserve the legitimacy of the court. It is a real concern that he has. That doesn't mean that we can count on him at all, but it does mean that hopefully we have a little bit of a cushion that we can fall back on. With Gorsuch, I think that it's really promising to see him join this opinion because he really didn't have any political need to do that. He had already been appointed to the court. We know that he's a very conservative guy, but he believed that the law either could be or should be interpreted this way, or that in ruling against LGBT rights, that he would be threatening the court. I kind of don't think that he was as concerned about legitimacy in reading the opinion. I think that he was mostly concerned about this is actually his belief. You cannot separate these two ideas. This does give us some additional precedent that we can fall back on as well. Although, each court case is a little bit different, and each of those factors plays a little bit of a different role. And so we'll have to kind of see what that means as it plays out over time. I will say this too, one more thing. So I don't know if any of you are interested in working for military schools, religious schools, or single gender schools. If you are, this Title VII ruling probably does not apply. So the Higher Ed Act basically allows those three groups to discriminate for any reason: religion, gender identity. And that's probably not going to change very soon, especially under this court.
Great. And so in terms of other kind of recent court decisions too, there's the one that's currently, that we just heard, that it was Amy Coney Barrett's first case, which was the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. In terms of the adoption that you brought up earlier, can you, for those of us who are not legal experts, can you please explain religious liberties to us, and
how is the court seeing this? Why is this such because this kind of goes into kind of what you were talking about, Josh, with the different classifications of schools or different entities. So for those of us who have not studied this, what should we know about that?
Yeah, so religious liberty is complicated, and that's always been the case in American history, I would argue. We have been constantly redefining what religious liberty is and how it plays out in the public sphere. I think that religious liberty has become especially important in recent years because of the change that we're seeing in our political economy or political body in the United States. We're seeing demographic changes that are pulling what used to be the traditional base away from Republicans and depositing it actually kind of somewhere in the middle. But religious liberty is one of the things that many conservative cis-white het people really cling to. It's part of their foundation of what America is. America is a place where you have the freedom of religion, and that means I get to do whatever I want if it's part of my religion. Not quite like that, but in some ways it comes down to that. And so the court has been constantly trying to mediate both religious liberty and the public's needs, and religious liberty and the religious liberties of other people. So, you know, if I want things one way and you want things a different way, and those are mutually exclusive, then maybe we're going to go to the Supreme Court to figure out which way it's going to land. And otherwise, you know, maybe my religion believes that we should be able to partake in a specific illegal substance in order to go on a spiritual journey, but state law prohibits that. So is that state law acceptable? Or is it unconstitutional? Does it prohibit me from engaging in my First Amendment right to practice religion in the way that I see fit? So I think that religious liberty is a vehicle that a lot of conservatives are using to try to reclaim ground that they feel that they've lost in the political environment. And they can use that as a tool to say, I don't believe in gay people. I don't believe that gay people should have rights. I think that it's an abomination against nature or whatever. And I think that the law should reflect that. And when the law does reflect that, I think the American people will be in a better, healthier place. I disagree with that. In fact, most of the religious people that I know disagree with that, but there are some very hard-bent, very conservative people who are carefully picking and choosing cases that they're going to chase up through the appellate process to the Supreme Court in order to try to adjust the way that we interpret the Constitution.
Great, thank you. And let's see, so in terms of some other questions that we've gotten through the various modes, I think that was part of this is also helping us kind of like advocate on behalf of, because I saw in here Gorsuch has gay friends and colleagues, and so again I go back, I'm a nonprofit person, right? So I go back to that kind of like public opinion. How can we advocate? How can we support these movements? And we had a question earlier too that was about kind of how can we best they say make conservative people support LGBTQ rights, right? So how can what is the kind of mode to be able to both keep up to date with some of this stuff? Like, where are you getting your information? How can I, as a non-legal person, get that information? And how can we then advocate for these, whether it's, you mentioned kind of like several things: engage politically, build our community locally. Can you expand on some other kind of action items, kind of takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, that's a great question. The grain of salt you should take my comments with is that I'm very establishment when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm not a radical in any way, probably because I spent 8 years working for politicians. Glitter bombing, for example. I don't condone glitter bombing. I don't think that changes anyone's mind. In case you've not heard of it, there were LGBT activists who would find conservatives and throw glitter on them to bomb them, basically, with glitter. That's not going to change anyone's mind. And if anything, that's going to make them more recalcitrant, and they're going to be more stuck in their beliefs than anything else. But again, take with a grain of salt. I'm not a radical in any way, shape, or form. So having worked for members of Congress, tweets don't work, emails don't work. Write them a letter. Emails are better than tweets. Phone calls are good. But the biggest thing that influences them is go to town halls. It's something none of us want to do. They are boring AF, to be blunt. But members of Congress listen if you show up, but only call your own representatives. Don't call Massachusetts. Don't call Alaska. Don't call California. If you are not their constituent, they do not listen to you. So if you're in ASU's district, you call Greg Stanton. Don't call Schweikert. Don't call Grijalva, Stanton. And then, of course, Sinema and Kelly are fair game. But you got to call your own. They do not listen to you if you are not in their district or their state. But show up, get involved, go to town hall meetings. If you are a member of a certain political party, whether you're Republican or Democrat, go to party meetings, get involved in those sort of party apparati, whatever the plural is, apparatuses, whatever. Get involved. It's the stuff that nobody likes to do. We all vote and we tweet and we make our profile photo black and we think we're doing something. You're not doing diddly. Voting's good, but the rest of it, no. So you got to get involved. And so I mentioned earlier that 2020 saw a record year in terms of LGBT folks running for office. In fact, Alabama was the only state, as far as we know, that did not have an LGBTQ person running for office. More of that sort of stuff is needed. Not necessarily running for office, but being out, being outspoken, getting people to know you, being out at work or whatever. And that's uncomfortable. It certainly is. Frankly, I don't tell my students. So if you're on the call, now you know. But it's one of those things that's very private and personal for me, so I don't practice what I'm preaching here. But it's absolutely true. I was reading an article post-election about how there's a young Latino gay mayor in like a town of 3 people in Nevada. You just got to show up and you have to be honest, I think. And people can connect with honesty. And when they see us as real people and not just Will and Grace or whatever, that's a decade old at this point, or more than that, not my favorite show, but when you're a real living human being, I think that's what matters. We can't make anyone support the issues of the community, but what we can do is humanize them, whether that's running for office or showing for town halls and being respectful. Members of Congress will listen, but you have to show them you're worth listening to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There are a lot of organizations. I don't want to make any assumptions about anybody and their political ideals, but groups like Indivisible have been really learning to leverage their presence and their positions in order to move members of Congress, even members of opposite parties. So they'll show up at Republican members of Congress's office with some kind of an event. Maybe it's a cake celebrating their retirement. They didn't know they were retiring, but they're supporting the wrong policy, and they're going to get kicked out. Whatever the case is, Matthew's right. Those are the things that they're going to listen to if you are their constituent. Additionally, I did make a small list of things that I would encourage people to consider. And this might be a response. I'm not sure if this question was in the chat or via email, but the question of whether you should quickly get married right now. So one, I would say that one thing we may want to do as a community is to ask ASU to make a public statement about our existence and their support for us as a community. That means that we're, maybe that statement is going to talk about our students. Maybe that statement is going to talk about our rights to employment and to benefits. But that is one thing that I think would bring a lot of us comfort in knowing that our institution is going to be fighting for us. So maybe we ask for them to come up with a specific statement about the LGBTQ community, and maybe even some specific internal policies assuring that we still get the same rights as our straight colleagues. After that, we've hit on this a lot. I'm going to say it because it's worth saying again. Talk to your members of Congress, talk to your representatives, talk to your executive office holders like the governor, show up to meetings if you can. And maybe you can't. I know we're all busy people. Some of us have kids and now they're not going to school and oh my goodness. So, if you can't make it to a meeting, have a buddy or three, and you have a text group and say, okay, who's going to this one? One of the four of us needs to go so we can come back and tell everybody what's going on. So stay as engaged as you can. Try to tune in to those city council meetings. Like Matthew said, they can be so dull, but trust, every once in a while, one of those community members comes up and says something real crazy. So look for those nuggets. Additionally, if you think that you may be in a challenging position, in a position that could be challenged by the courts, I'm going to say, don't listen to us today in making your game plan for the future. Instead, make an appointment with a family lawyer. Talk to your family lawyer about the things that you need to do to protect yourself and your family. It's not a bad idea to do that in the next couple of months. I believe that ASU has a person who ASU staff and faculty can consult for free, but I don't know the details about that. I'm being a bad advisor. But maybe do some Googling and see if that's a good option for you if you've got family friends. But maybe we're not super concerned about marriage equality, but maybe if you're trying to adopt, maybe it's a good time to make a certain move to protect that. And then the last thing is, and this is kind of a response to one of the email questions that I saw earlier, talk to people. In 1951, James Allport, who was a sociologist, published a study, and he published a theory that he called the contact theory. And contact theory is this. It's the idea that the more exposure I have to somebody in a different social or identity group, the better I'm going to feel about that group. It's that simple. And it really seems to play out in study after study. So maybe, if you've got a neighbor who really just doesn't seem to treat Black people very kindly, if there's a way to introduce a Black person to that neighbor and maybe have them be a presence in the neighbor's life, it's really possible and increasingly likely that that neighbor's bias is going to shift away from that. And the same thing is true for the LGBT community. We did not make the giant leaps that we made from the 90s until now just by quietly sitting around. We did it by being present and by having difficult conversations. So that's the other side of this too, is if you want to convince people, if you want to break down the partisan gridlock, if you want to bring civility back into politics, the kind of civility that helps us to assure the rights of marginalized people groups, then you got to start talking to some of these people. I am guilty. In 2016, I did a massive, massive social media purge. Goodbye to everybody from my hometown in Marion, Indiana. Goodbye, half the people I knew from whatever. It was time to clean that stuff out. And now I'm slowly trying to add them back so that we can have some challenging conversations. Not with every stranger, not on every Facebook post, but carefully making incremental appearances in their lives, sticking up when I see something that I think is really wrong. Oh gosh, this post is, making fun of trans kids. I'm just going to say that, this seems kind of cruel, or maybe I'll PM this person and say that I think they should take that post down. That might be a good way to open up a conversation. Use your active listening skills as well when you're having these conversations. A lot of times, the people that you're talking to who seem to hate us the most are just the most scared. And so and not always, don't put yourself in danger, but if you can listen actively, then you can maybe get to the real root of their arguments, the real root of their fears or concerns, and begin to address them with evidence over time by building rapport. This is nothing that's going to happen in one Facebook conversation. This is nothing that's going to happen in a couple of days. But over time, these relationships can change the way people see our group. And I think that that's kind of what we're hitting on a lot in the chat. From what I'm seeing, it's really hard to keep track of both. And it's a lot of what we talk about in politics. So active listening, but engage. Don't be afraid to say something. Say it in the nicest way you can. Say it in the most welcoming way that you can, but engage and try to change people's minds.
Yeah, Josh is right. Just a quick little factoid, because I'm an academic and I can't help it. But a big reason why the cities are democratic and the rural areas are not is exactly what Josh is talking about. When you live in an urban area, you're consistently encountering people who are not like you, which makes you more tolerant. And to slightly overgeneralize, when you live in a more rural or agricultural area, they tend to be much more sort of homogenous. And we kind of get in those bubbles, but it's absolutely why we've seen this shift over the past couple of decades of the cities and the suburbs shifting more progressive, while the rural areas are becoming more conservative, and it's because of this issue exactly.
And the conservative areas are becoming more evangelical, which I would say politically or policy-wise is a challenge for our community. So if you used to be a churchgoer and don't hate the taste, maybe it's time to find a pew again.
So I know, kind of along those lines too, I know we have some students on the line, I believe, in various capacities. And, the holidays are always a time when these kind of conversations come up. We're sitting around the dinner table or whatever it's going to look like. We're sitting around the Zoom, whatever it's going to look like this year. But we always start to have these conversations, I feel like, throughout about kind of safety at home. And I know this is kind of veering off from Supreme Court, what we originally started on, but I feel like it's worth kind of mentioning, kind of what, again, we have some great takeaways. And I do want to point out that we are all taking notes and this is being recorded. So as we go quickly, and I'm doing my best Rachel Maddow to kind of take some notes here. But
there will be a quiz.
But we'll post this on the Canvas later.
Yeah, right.
Don't get ahead of yourselves. First, read the website.
It's true. So what, you guys have given some great information about kind of some action, but on a very personal level too, how do we start those conversations, just being safe and feeling, and I know sometimes that's not possible. Yeah. So any advice out there for
I'm the wrong person to ask. I'll get personal for just a moment, but I had to cut my parents out of my life a few years ago. It was both the hardest and the best decision I've ever made, and I regret it every single day, but I know that I had to do it for myself. Very conservative, very religious. They think they're saving my soul. They don't do it from a place of hate. They truly think they love me and they're saving me from eternal damnation, but it is not a productive relationship. So I'm a firm believer in you choose your friends and not your family. And so there's that. And I remember, this is not quite related, but your question sparked it. I remember being a 20-year-old being snuck into a gay bar for the first time. Statute of limitations, I think, is over. And I sat down and, in my younger years, for some reason, the older folks always wanted to talk to me. And so I got into this conversation with someone that was so enlightening and interesting, someone who survived the AIDS era. But the one thing I remember from this conversation more than anything was the statement, to be gay is to be political. And I have never forgotten that statement. And I'm going to be old man yells at cloud for a moment. And I think the younger generation, has completely lost sight of this. And I have so many students that are even in political science classes where they're not all that politically engaged, and they don't, young gay students, LGBTQ students, and they don't quite see the drive to be, because they can go to a straight bar and be be normal. They don't have to have that safe space that I had to be snuck into, in deep East Texas where I was going to, undergrad. So anyway, I can't answer the question. I'm just sort of telling life stories, but, my best advice is sometimes knowing when to walk away is the best thing, which is not what you're asking, but it took me a long time to get to that point. And like I said, I don't love that decision, but it was the best for me. But I think I found solace in my political family and, doing work and fighting for the cause. And that's been what has helped me sort of cope with it in a way. And by cope, I mean completely ignore it and just focus on other things. But that's how I've dealt with it, for better or for worse. But Josh, you probably have way better advice here than I do.
Oh, girl, so. My story.
Yeah, I do.
I grew up in a very conservative evangelical home in Midwestern, literally the dead middle of Indiana. I came out actually 15 years ago tomorrow. Very excited for my coming out anniversary. But it came out and things were not great. My dad worked for the largest private university in Indiana, which was an evangelical conservative university. To give you a little bit of the flavor of that university, you were not allowed to watch R-rated movies, play M-rated video games, have girls in your dorm room. It wasn't until the 90s that you could go to a movie theater or play face cards, go fish. And so this was a very conservative school. I came out at 18 and it was a disaster. I spent the first night at a girlfriend's house just hiding out. My parents were not supportive, but I remember the next week, and this is a little, maybe not how you'll do this at Christmas, but the next week I went to my dad's office and he'd cleared out. He worked in student affairs too. It's a family business, but he had a whole shelf of fidget toys and puzzles and things. that he'd, I think, hand to students while they were being punished or something like that. I noticed that when I came in that next week, that shelf was empty of toys and it was full of books. And those books were how to support your queer child, what it means when someone comes out to you, the gay experience in college, because I was a college administrator. But I remember that moment, you know, I could tell that he had the intellectual curiosity and the love for me to have some really important conversations. And as a result, my dad and I were able to have some really important conversations throughout my college career. And up until very recently, he continued working at that University in Wesleyan as the sole person trying to change policy to improve the situation for the queer community there. It has not been easy. He and my mom have been very isolated from the community. It has been a real challenge, but he has made a lot of people's lives better. I will also say that I have a story that's a little analogous, and it's for years I would go home at Christmas and there would always be one political fight. We don't drink, so I mean, it wasn't alcohol related, but there was always one. I remember going back in 2014 and having, you know, just a shouting match about Michael Brown and about whether he deserved to die in Ferguson, Missouri. And I remember leaving Christmas that year just feeling heartbroken because I did not understand how my family could feel that it was appropriate for a young man to be murdered in the street by a police officer. Kind of political. And what I found is that since then, we have continued to be able to have these difficult conversations. Sometimes we have to walk away from those conversations. Sometimes we have to say, whoa, girl, we have gotten too heated. We got to step away. I am too invested emotionally in this and I cannot engage you anymore. So let's take a break and come back to this. But I will say this spring, both of my parents sent me Black Lives Matter texts. So I would say that in 6 years of difficult conversations, we've been able to come around. Also, about 5 years ago, I brought my then partner at the time home to see my family. My mom said, you are my fifth son. You are my son. It is not impossible to see people change. It is not impossible to see people's opinions change. It takes patience, it takes listening, and that's what it is. It takes discomfort. It's not always easy to sit down with your racist uncle and try to hear what he's saying and pick out the things that you can engage carefully to just plant that smallest seed of doubt in his worldview. But that's what we're trying to do. So don't expect for there to be one conversation that fixes this. Don't expect to be able to resolve this over Christmas dinner, over Hanukkah dinner. Instead, be planting seeds, be constantly, thinking of ways that you can, without being mean, without making it a dig, dropping little seeds that your family can maybe reflect on, or that you can use as a foothold next year, or the next time you see them to have some of these challenging conversations. The other thing that I would say is make it personal. Talk to your family in the terms of the way these policies affect you personally. And if you can't, if this is about trans bathrooms and you identify as a cisgender person, then try to find a different way that you can engage that's similar. Talking about maybe, being out of place and not feeling safe, or ways that, that maybe ties into your own experiences or the experience of a relative. But these are ways that I think we can really leverage that theory that Allport gave us, that contact theory to really make people change their minds and see the world in a different way. But I will say that, just again, active listening, that stuff is amazing. If you have not practiced active listening, look it up, do some practice time with a partner or a friend, somebody that you trust. You will be amazed at how much that can change a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you.
Great. I want to thank you both for sharing those personal stories, because I think from both perspectives, I think this is something that, I think for you, Matthew, I think that's something that I think our students also need to hear. And, you said you don't like to typically share, but now it's recorded. So I'm just kidding. But I think
TikTok famous, soon to be, right?
So, but I think that because all too often, from the work that I've done with students, as well as an advisor for one of the LGBT organizations, and through the work on campuses too, things sometimes are, and I'm speaking more towards our undergrads, but it could be across the board. you know, kind of see staff, faculty as like, oh, well, you figured it out. And it's like, well, we really have it, a lot of us. And so I think, a lot of, and there is that kind of generational kind of movement. There's abilities to learn and to still connect. And while, and you spoke to it as well, Matthew, of kind of seeing kind of where kind of some of the historical knowledge starts to whether it's not being taught in schools, whether, from wherever that's coming from, we could all kind of have our theories about that. But as we move away from what that history was, and, I'm sure there's many people on the call that were part of that and can, speak so much to, and let me tell you what it was like back when I was a kid kind of stuff. But I think there's such still value in that. And and on the same end, there's value in our students allowing our students to also lead the way in some of those conversations, because they come up with these things and I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but it sounds cool. like well, I don't know what that flag means. I'm trying to stay on top of this too, you guys. But so I think, kind of, so being able to share and to whatever capacity, right, we all feel comfortable with, because not everybody's in that space. But I think that's something that as we move forward with with that question of like, what can ASU do? Right. And so we've had, these kind of larger conversations about, we create a space that's specifically, LGBT friendly, or a kind of an intersectional space that's, a safe zone, but then also, then we want the entire campus to be that. So we take that space away and then we, create all of the spaces to be that. And now it's like, we're back in the conversation of we need a safe space again. And so it's kind of like back and forth. And it's like, sometimes you just want I think part of it is also kind of figuring out what do we want as a group, or what can we see? And so for everyone else on the call too as well, and this is kind of part of the mission of what the staff, the LGBTQ plus staff and faculty association is here to help support, is kind of what are those little things that everyone's hearing, like what is happening in your life, whether you're graduate student, undergrad, we want to be able to be there for that, as Josh has mentioned before, kind of that voice on the larger university level too. So I do encourage everybody to kind of, know that there is a place for those messages to kind of move up the chain, so to speak. And so we'll kind of get back to that too as we wrap up. I see there's some more things coming through. I don't know if you guys want to talk about while I read what's happening in the chat.
Let's see. So I would say that one of the questions that we had emailed to us before was the question, I know we kind of hit on this, but they have a daughter or a niece, who's planning to get married this April and wants to know whether they should be concerned. I'm sorry, my cat wants to make a cameo. Whether they should be concerned about their ability to get married in April. And I would say there is practically no chance that you will lose your niece will lose her marriage rights in April. It would take a lot longer than that. So, again, I might encourage her to consult a family lawyer, but I would say that she's probably very safe just waiting. And, it sounds like from the question as well that she may have the means to, skip the border and head to California if worse comes to worse. So California is always going to be our destination from here in Phoenix, I think, for gay marriages if we lose our rights.
And then too, I do want to bring up a couple of another few things as I was doing some research for this, is that Arizona is a no second parent adoption states too, as well as there's currently no foster care non-discrimination law. So there's, again, there's beyond to hark back to our, it's more than just marriage, is kind of these other, it affects larger issues as well too. Being overall family rights, and those four things again that Josh brought up were marriage equality, right, adoption, family rights, job security, and privacy. I guess the privacy is maybe the one that we haven't hit on as much, but if anyone wants to kind of speak to that as we see, I think we've hit most questions, but
I would say personally, privacy is probably the one, if marriage is what I'm least concerned, well, no, I think privacy is probably what I'm the least concerned about. And the reason for that is I think that most politicians have realized that legislating what people are allowed to do sexually in their own bedrooms is not super helpful, and is honestly, in a lot of ways, more likely to bite them in the butt than it is to bite their constituents. And so, I do think that it's really unlikely that we lose our ability to express our love physically in the way that we see is appropriate. But it is something to be careful about. And that's how I would see privacy. The privacy concern is simply in our ability to express love in the bedroom the way that we see as appropriate. Matthew, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't. What you said was great. There's a comment in the chat about, making sure our communities are open to everyone, including people of color. And, that's a problem everywhere in America, frankly, being inclusive and open. And, there's a term from sociology I talk about all the time, which is social isolation. I didn't use the term earlier, but it's this, I'm sorry, social segregation. Social isolation is a term, but not what I meant. Social segregation. It's the term that, at least for most Americans, but humans in general, there's like this natural tendency to surround ourselves with people who are just like us across any demographic feature. How many PhDs or BFFs with high school dropouts? How many rich people are friends with poor people? We just don't encounter each other that often in our day-to-day crossings. And so, part of it's just due to residential segregation or educational segregation that causes us to be socially segregated. There's all these different kinds. And so it's certainly an issue about making sure you're just warm and welcoming and open, and understanding that, my experience is not necessarily the same as someone who's a person of color, even if they're in the same community, or a woman, or, fill in the blank, rich versus poor versus old versus young. All of our experiences are different and should be valued. And, it's definitely, I think, something everyone should be mindful of. And, these discussions, just because of sort of the historical nature of the country, often tend to be centered around white males. Just think about gays' portrayal in the media. I kind of touched on Will and Grace and tongue in cheek earlier, but we can just think about how gays are portrayed in the media. It's obviously almost always very good looking, sort of straight looking white dudes, right? And so that's a whole nother Zoom series. Actually, you've got your next topic there, but it's certainly something to be cognizant of.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that just a little bit, it's something I wrote in my notes, but and so I'm glad I found a place to drop it. But those of you on the call who are white, cis appearing, and or cis identifying especially, we need to carry most of this burden. We need to be the ones answering questions, having the harder conversations, because really what our community has done in a lot of ways over its existence is relied on the most marginalized people in our community to drive us forward, and then we abandon them once we get where we think we want to be. And so we have a strong responsibility right now to, if you are a white guy, to answer questions, to put yourself out there, to be visible, to be present, in a way that it probably would be even less safe for a person of color, a trans person in our community. So I think that ties into the visibility question. I, a couple of years ago, decided that it was going to be part of my professional identity to be an out professional. And so it was going to show up everywhere. I was going to join the LGBT Staff and Faculty Association, and you might see that on my resume. And I've engaged with Matthew actually in writing some queer literature for our discipline. So, but it's these things we have privilege and we need to use it. And in using that privilege appropriately, we will inevitably make our community more accepting and create safer places for the people around us. That's not the only step. There's a lot we've got to do to make sure that the space is welcoming and supportive of people who are in those intersectional identities. But we know from intersectionality that in terms of the gay hierarchy, in terms of the queer hierarchy, cis appearing white men have it the easiest. And so we need to be the ones working the hardest. Otherwise, we're just relying on Marsha P. Blackburn and all of the people that have been fighting before us and doing the legwork. So that's my other challenge to you. stay in touch with the LGBT Faculty and Staff Association, and be the one who's willing to answer questions and have hard conversations.
So echoing the earlier question, how do we have these conversations? I feel totally called out by Josh right now. I do all the things that Matthew doesn't do, right? Heard, Josh. So
it's just with your family. I'm not judging you.
Well, but even professionally, like I said, I don't tell again, this is another Zoom topic, focus, but it's like, it's not relevant to what I teach, and it isn't, frankly, but it comes back to the advice I gave, right, which is we should be visible and talking about these things. And I had a colleague once in another job that was like, I make a point in every class to tell students that I'm gay, so they can see he has a PhD from Harvard and Yale, so they can see a successful gay person. And if they want to give me shit, so be it. Sorry if I wasn't supposed to drop that word, Zach, in the recording. But, I understand that message, but it's so hard as a conservative Texas evangelical or product of an evangelical family to do it. And I realize I have it the easiest. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I am guilty as charged.
That's great. Yeah. Oh,
No.
Oh man, thank you guys so much. This has been a really wonderful hour and a half. I've really enjoyed it. And time's been flying. So thank you both so much for your insight, for your knowledge dropping, for sharing your own stories, for our larger conversations. And I'm going to toss it back to Zach, because we've talked about this now several times. How can we get involved? What are we going to do? What this kind of community conversation could then lead to? Where are we going from here? So I'm going to toss it back over to Zach, to kind of fill in these last few minutes and let you know how you too can get involved.
If only you could have heard me just now. I was saying, okay, I'm going to try not to pull a Matthew. Then I unmuted myself. Now I'm going to try to switch over to my screen sharing to share one more slide with you here. Again, this has been a incredibly fruitful discussion. There we go. And we really do want to continue this series of conversations through the Faculty Staff Association. We have been in talks with Stanley James and our now retired Vice Provost for Inclusion and Community Engagement, as well as Tiffany Lopez, her successor, who just formally took over that role this past Monday. And Tiffany is incredibly passionate about weaving together the very disparate community interests that we all represent here at ASU. And I remember seeing over in the chat this idea of sticks in a bundle, and that's exactly what through Tiffany's area she is hoping to accomplish. We have also advertised this particular dialogue through the Committee for Campus Inclusion. There are a lot of overlaps between the work that our various committees do, the Faculty Women's Association, and that's something that here in our Faculty Staff Association, as we sort of reestablish ourselves now, is something that we're doing. We're looking around at the landscape, seeing that there are so many diversity inclusion initiatives within the academic colleges, within my own academic home in the graduate college. We're just starting up our own committee as well. And I think that's such important work, but it needs to be done not in isolation, but in conjunction with our various groups. And so that's something that we're really looking forward to doing as we move forward. But this community programming is really the centerpiece of what we're trying to do as far as getting some of these conversations going, learning what the needs of our community are, and supporting them. So this is will be a monthly dialogue session going forward. We're taking a pause in December, January, as we all re-get our bearings for the spring semester. But we do invite you to like us on Facebook through the Faculty Staff Association, or to join our listserv, another link on the screen there. We'll also be taking a look at some of the comments here about starting up a Slack channel. I think that's a phenomenal idea, and I volunteered us to take the lead on getting that figured out and established. Down the line, we would love to, we have been working on a web presence for some time, and I think we're at a critical point where we can get some movement done on that. In the meantime, we really invite any feedback from you on what these conversations need to be. We've got several sketched out in their preliminary phases for the spring, but Matthew and Josh and you've set a very incredibly high bar for us for our future programming. So you're all pains in my ass now moving forward. So thank you for that. But I want to keep this momentum that we've established here going. So to any of you, any one of our viewers, please do reach out to me. My email is right there on the screen. We really do value your feedback on what we can do to balance being informative and entertaining as our facilitator and two guests here have done. So that is my bit of a spiel. To close up, I'll open the floor to Anne, Josh, Matthew, or anyone else with any last closing comments as we quickly approach the 6 o'clock hour here.
I want to thank you, Zach and Anne, and the rest of the LGBT Faculty and Staff Association for putting this on. I think that these kinds of conversations are so essential, and it is so wonderful to know that we have people in our community who care about getting us organized and making sure that our needs are met. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And for everybody else, I'm going to just reiterate, please have those hard conversations. It will be worth it. And don't be afraid. We've got this. We will be in it together, and we will take care of each other.
Just thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Just say, if you're afraid, do it scared. Have the hard conversation scared.
Absolutely. And thank you also, before I forget, we've received so much email from folks asking if they have undergraduate students, or if they're a member of the larger Phoenix community, not even necessarily a part of ASU, or if they're not part of our LGBTQ community, if they can still be at this discussion. And we're so incredibly glad that you are all here, because this visibility and this allyship and this communal problem solving is really what's at the heart of making any of our diversity inclusion initiatives work. So again, thank you so much to everyone that's been here. We expected maybe 4 or 5 folks to join us, largely because everyone knows that Matthew just talks on and on and on and tends to bore people. But surprisingly, there were nearly 70 of you here today. So I'm incredibly gratified to see that. All right, any closing thoughts as we wrap up then? Anyone else in our audience? All right, well, we will go ahead and wrap up for the night. We will send out an email. We have all of your email addresses from the registration. So as we start to cement our spring programming lineup, we'll make sure to get information about that out to folks, as well as reminders about joining our Facebook group, our listserv, and then as these things roll out, our web and or Slack social media presences. So thank you all for being here with us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon.